Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Ciara Brennan, and I am the Director of the Environmental Justice Network Ireland. So, by way of background, EJNI was launched in 2019 and is a platform for collaboration between NGOs, lawyers, academics, civil society, and grassroots organisations. And we seek to address the root causes of environmental injustice on the island of Ireland, but we also look at developments at EU and international level to see how all these issues interact. So today we are co-hosting this webinar on Ecocide and the question of ecocide on the island of Ireland. And our co-hosts are Ecocide. So what I'm going to do first of all is introduce Jojo Mehta, who is a co-founder of Stop Ecocide. And then I'll introduce Juneseo Hwang, who is a postgraduate research associate. So without further ado, Jojo Mehta co-founded Stop Ecocide in 2017 alongside barrister and legal pioneer Polly Higgins to support the establishment of ecocide as a crime at the International Criminal Court. So Jojo is the CEO and spokesperson, and she's overseen a remarkable growth of the movement while coordinating between legal developments, diplomatic traction, and public narrative. Jojo is chair of the charitable Stop Ecocide Foundation, and she also convenes the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide, chaired by Philippe Sands QC and Dior Falso. The resulting definition, which was launched in 2017, in June 2021, has catalyzed legislative development. So we're seeing lots of interest in this across the world, recommendations and resolutions at national, regional, and international levels. Jojo is a graduate of Oxford and London universities and has a background in communications, entrepreneurship, and on-the-ground environmental campaigning. With a natural ability to connect and inspire, coupled with an unshakable faith in the human imagination and capacity for positive change, she's contributed to UN conferences, diplomatic events, law and business summits, as well as podcasts, interviews, and articles for publications with broadcasters ranging from Time Magazine, New York Times, and The Guardian to the BBC. So we're very lucky to have Jojo here at our webinar today. So to talk a bit about Ecocide, Stop Ecocide International, the whole goal is to generate fertile collaborations at diplomatic and political level, as well as across civil society, with lawyers, academics, corporate influencers, Indigenous and faith leaders, NGOs, and grassroots campaigns. As a result, the legal recognition of ecocide is emerging as a really powerful driver of change and a key solution addressing the climate and ecological crisis. So I think it's really, really fantastic that this work is now being looked at in the context of the island of Ireland. And we really want to explore in this webinar today about what the potential for that is. So I'm going to also introduce now June, who is a postdoctoral research associate at DFG Humanities Centers for Advanced Studies, Futures of Sustainability at the University of Hamburg. So June finished his doctoral thesis on sustainable peace through the protection of communities from ecological injustices and crime in Northern Ireland at Queen's University Belfast. And I have read that thesis and it is fantastic. So if anyone ever has a chance to have a look at June's thesis, it's a masterclass in this type of work, which looks at how grassroots organizations and movements can influence, really, really significant developments in policy and law. June has also conducted sociological and criminological research on environmental rights, ecological justice, environmental criminal law, and peace building. So we're delighted to be collaborating with Stop Ecocide International today and to have both Jojo and June here to speak to us, and really looking forward to the webinar and to hopefully some brilliant questions from anybody attending. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over now to Caitlin McElhennon, who is the research coordinator for EJNI, who's just going to do a couple of housekeeping bits and pieces before handing over to Jojo. Thank you very much.
So housekeeping bits are very simple, and the webinar will consist of 2 presentations. And after each presentation, we've dedicated some time to questions and answers. So if you just use the question and answers box that you should have access to, that would make it easier for me to facilitate those questions. And that's the end of housekeeping. So I'll hand it over to Jojo now for the first presentation. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Ciara. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. And this is it's kind of like the latest chapter in a very fast growing conversation that is happening all around the world. And it's I mean, when I say fast growing, for international law, it's almost been rocket speed in the sense that 5 years ago there were no governments publicly talking about criminalizing ecocide, or the worst harms to nature. And now, just a couple of months ago, we've seen the adoption by the European Union of a new environmental crimes directive, an updated one that includes effectively a qualified offence that would address conduct comparable to ecocide. And June will be addressing this more specifically in relation to Ireland later. But that just gives you a sense of, from zero to EU legislation in 5 years is very, very fast. And there are a number of reasons for this. And we feel that this is kind of the moment for this law. And perhaps a way of sort of setting that context is just to talk about briefly about how there is, of course, a big body of environmental laws around the world. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but it's been building up over the last few decades. But it is still not well followed in many instances, not well monitored or enforced. And so what we've obviously, we're in a situation of global climate and environmental crisis, in part because of this. And what we understand from that, I think, is something that's really quite profoundly cultural, which is that we have a problem in our global economic culture in taking seriously the harm to the living world. And that, we feel is an actual, quite a deeply embedded cultural issue that's been around for actually probably centuries. When the economic system that currently dominates the globe, which obviously has evolved from the Western canon of thought, when that was at its beginnings, there was definitely a sense that, human beings were the kind of lords and masters of nature, if you like, and that it was, our God-given right to exploit natural resources that were seen as pretty much infinite. And maybe at that time they actually felt like they were. And I think, if anybody ever had any doubt about that, that disappeared as soon as we had pictures from space of the Earth, in the sense that, we are in a closed system here, and we are part of that system. But our particular cultural mindset doesn't acknowledge that, and therefore our legal system doesn't either. And what we have is a situation where a lot of very good environmental regulation is often not followed. And we also see that there's a kind of attitude towards that that can be a little bit like I suppose there's a bit of a tendency to perhaps game the system a bit, to sort of say, well, these are very specific instructions about what we can do in this context, and we'll take it right to the limit all the time. So that's one aspect. Another aspect that often happens is actually almost just a cost benefit analysis. Effectively, it's cheaper, quicker, easier not to tick all the boxes that we know we should tick. And we've even had companies in private say that to us, that, they kind of like to tick all the boxes, but actually it's quicker and cheaper not to, and nobody's checking. So we have those kinds of attitudes that emerge within this space. And then at the same time, those crimes that do exist in the environmental space internationally, I mean, there are not many, but there are some, wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, those kinds of things, are already incredibly lucrative in the criminal world. They're already at a level that is equivalent to something like drug trafficking. And yet the investigation, the reporting, the prosecutions are minuscule in comparison. So, so that kind of just paints a picture of the context in which we believe this particular initiative, in other words, to criminalize the worst harms and to say these are crimes and they are serious crimes, is actually very important, both in terms of being able to sort of create a kind of almost a sort of container or a foundation that underlies and underpins environmental laws and reinforces and strengthens them. Because obviously it's a very different thing to be, in breach of a regulation and potentially risking criminal liability. That's a very different question. And that leads to the other aspect of this, which is such an important aspect of criminal law, which is not just the accountability, but also the deterrence. So what at the moment happens is that, those core issues are not necessarily considered at the drawing board stage of big projects, and they should be. And to use a very simple example from the UK, I'm thinking of HS2, the express trainway that has been being developed between London and Birmingham, and there's been huge environmental protests around it because the route goes through over 100 ancient, effectively irreplaceable, hundreds of years old woodlands. Now, if ecocide law had been in place when that project was conceived, I don't have any doubt the project would still have been, planned, but I can be pretty sure that it would not have been, planned to go through 108 ancient woodlands. These are things that are, these approaches are definitely possible, but they're not being done because there isn't this sense of the seriousness. So that I think is a kind of good example of what could potentially have been averted had the law been in place. And what we're seeing now, of course, with the rapid development of interest in ecocide law and, of course, in actual legislative action, is that there's a kind of direction of travel that is being established. And I think the developments at the EU have really cemented that. But we've also, over the last year, seen proposals being put into individual jurisdictions, individual parliaments of particular countries, Mexico, Italy, Spain, Scotland, the Netherlands. And actually, literally just this week, we've just heard that Peru has also just had a proposal of ecocide law. So, they're proliferating around the world as this direction of travel is established. And I think that's really important. And it's showing that the conversation has a very concrete effect at that high level. So that's really important. And I think, again, it's important to think of the serious crime, the fact that we, as an organization, have always aimed for the International Criminal Court, to say that ecocide should actually be alongside crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes. It's a way of expressing the severity of the situation we face climatically and ecologically on the planet. It's a way of showing that is a deeply serious issue. And it's also a way of reframing the kind of morality around damage to the environment, because criminal law does have that ability to capture a kind of a moral aspect. I mean, there's not really a huge moral stigma attached to breaching regulation, but when you bring in the criminal aspect, it has that far more serious and more ethical aspect to it, which is actually fundamentally important if we're going to emerge from what is no doubt going to be a very tricky couple of decades in as few pieces as possible. We need to have these particular foundational pieces in place. Now, as sort of one of the things that we're often sort of asked about in this context, because I mean, ecocide law is a particular strategic intervention, if you like. It's not something that's going to, cure everything or instantly have everybody behave wonderfully from one day to the next. But it is absolutely sort of key in that picture. That outer framework is key. And we're often asked, what are the obstacles? And I have to say that from our experience, the biggest obstacle is simply a lack of understanding. Because there is this tendency with thinking about crime and criminal law that we have these things that happen in our minds when we talk about crime, or we run down a dark alley with a knife, because that's what we think of when we think of crime, and we forget that actually criminal law has this deterrent protective aspect. And in fact, it's what we use to say what is dangerous. And so perhaps I could sort of come to a conclusion of this sort of an introductory part by just saying that it's, well, in a sense, our sort of biggest task is actually having that the understanding come through that it is actually a very straightforward and kind of positive move to bring this crime into place. It's an interesting narrative place to be. It's sort of on the edge of positive and negative in terms of people's perceptions. But it's what we're discovering more and more is that even though it's such a simple proposition, ecocide law is almost like a Swiss Army knife in terms of the fact that it's actually a tool in the hands of so many different people, whether that's creating accountability, whether that is providing the thinking parameters in the financial and business world, for example, and whether it's potentially, within I mean, it's interesting to think about it in the context of, for example, rights of nature, which is a movement that is growing also very fast around the world. And there are now over 30 jurisdictions where, judgments have been made, taking account of sort of legal personhood or legal rights of particular landscapes or landscape features, for example. And there's a relationship there that is also positive, in the sense that it's almost like ecocide law is a complement or another side of the coin to rights of nature. You can have it's really important to acknowledge rights, but what protects the rights is actually that it's a crime to breach them. I mean, that's very obvious in the human rights sphere. Your right to life is protected by the fact that murder is a crime. So so there's this kind of reciprocal relationship there. But what this is also showing is a kind of a convergence that is happening. So it's happening with the growth in the rights of nature. It's happening with the growth of climate litigation. I mean, we've seen some interesting results recently, both the case in the European Court of Human Rights with the older Swiss women complaining about the and having the judgment in their favor around the government not taking enough action climate wise. But also this week, we've also seen the advisory opinion from the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, effectively stating that governments have a duty to look at their climate responsibilities, and actually for the developed countries to take proportionally more action. So we're seeing a kind of convergence of these different legal avenues kind of joining in with this conversation, and ecocide law is a very key piece as part of that kind of movement towards the recognition of the importance of legal avenues to protect climate and nature, but also, of course, to protect communities and people in those contexts. So, I mean, I think I'll leave it there for my introductory bit, but I'm really happy to come back with, with questions and further discussion later.
Thank you, Jojo. That was an excellent presentation. And we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box, but they seem to relate more to the implementation of ecocide legislation on the island of Ireland. So, Carinder, thank you so much for your questions, but we'll save those potentially for after June's presentation. So we do have one question from Lamert Van Ran. Is it fair to say that we see a sort of general emerging new paradigm in how we treat the world and thus ourselves? And how would you call that? So that's a tough question. That's a big question.
Well, I have to say, I think the simple answer is yes. I do think we are seeing a new paradigm emerging. And I think that, it's funny, it's making me think of that phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. It's actually something that many different areas of, of law, of academia, of policy making, of NGOs and activists, there's a whole kind of confluence of actors that are helping to nourish, I think, this emergence of a new way of thinking of ourselves in relation to nature, and therefore also a new way of thinking of our responsibilities towards the living world around us. And I also think it's possibly worth just mentioning that it is quite a European or a kind of Western developed world type approach to think of environmental damage and human rights violations as two completely separate things. But actually what we see as soon as we get a bit more global with our perspective, I mean, we have regional directors in Africa and Latin America who would tell us instantly that those two things are actually very closely intertwined. And actually that speaks to what I think Lamert is asking there around the relationship between humanity and the ecosystems, the living world in which we live and which we are, utterly dependent upon, but also we have this huge influence over. So yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is yes, and the longer answer is it's a kind of collective effort. And whether I have a particular name for that, I'm not entirely sure.
Thanks, Jojo. Okay, I think we're ready to start your presentation, Jin. If you're ready, yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar. My presentation will be a bit more about Ireland, so context, country specific. And this presentation is based on my short paper, briefing paper published by the EGNI on the implementation of Ecocide law on the island of Ireland. So thank you very much, Jojo, again. To summarize the nature of criminal law, I just want to reiterate the point here that ecocide law is a means of people's will that represents a people's will to control our society, particularly economy, in a more democratic and sustainable way. So that we can hold polluters accountable who have evaded responsibility for environmental pollution in many ways, in many different ways. So the concept of ecocide initially evolved from resistance against the weaponization of scientific findings, especially what we call the Agent Orange that was used in the Vietnamese rainforest during the Vietnam War, especially by the US Air Forces. But I'd like to also make a point that the UK government also used chemicals to destroy the rainforest in the Malaysian land to have a combat against kind of communist fighters back in the 1950s. So now the concept of ecocide has evolved to criminalize corporate activities that cause excessive environmental damage, and we are trying to hold those corporations more accountable for ecological restoration as well. So this ecocide law represents people's will. That is more than higher sentencing. So just more than high sentencing for polluters, but this we are trying to change. Sorry. We're trying to change a way of thinking and changing the underlying logic of modern societies that profit comes first before the planet. So we want to change the planet comes first before profits. That benefits only a few people on our planet. So criminalizing ecocide calls for polluter don't pollute principle. Now, modern environmental law has the principle of polluter pays principle, but this principle is basically quite retrospective. So pollution is allowed, but then pollution will be cleaned up. So Polly Higgins, who was co-founder of the Stop Ecocide International with Jojo, she wrote a book on ecocide and she proposed this polluter don't pollute principle. So this is what the deterrence effect of criminal law can have. And also criminalizing ecocide would place higher standards for due diligence and duty of care for the planet, and also governmental and corporate accountability. And finally, the protection of environmental defenders. So I will go through these points in the context of Ireland. Before I do that, I'd like to highlight some takeaways from the new European Directive on Environmental Crime. So the original European Environmental Crime Directive was adopted in 2008, and that time Ireland was also a signatory of the directive. But now the European Union has changed its stance on a Green New Deal and also sustainability issues towards a more concrete and sustainable way of being a green European Union. So the revision of the Environmental Crime Directive was part of it, was part of the European Union's Green Deal project. And the revised EU directive on environmental crime was passed maybe a few months ago, and now the final text of the directive is available on its website. I was trying to post that on the chat box, but I couldn't do that. But you're welcome to try to find the website. You can Google that. If you look at the directive, one of the highlights from the directive is that the list of environmental crime is going to be increased from 9 types of environmental crime to now 18 types of environmental crime. The list of environmental crime will be longer and will get longer and longer as the European Commission monitors the situations of environmental crime and environmental pollution across Europe. So one of the important developments in the revised EU Environmental Crime Directive is that its inclusion of its mention of ecocide in its directive. So in its article 21, it says qualified criminal offenses comparable to ecocide shall be criminalized, punished. And the European Union also makes references to the developments of ecocide legislation at the national levels and also at the international level, particularly thanks to the Stop Ecocide International's campaigns. Interestingly here, because we are talking about Ireland and Denmark decided to opt out from the directive. Ireland does have a capacity to do that because back in 2008, Ireland didn't have a capacity to opt out from the directive. But after the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty, according to Protocol 21, that grants Ireland and the United Kingdom, although the United Kingdom left the European Union already, but that protocol granted the two governments to choose whether to opt in or opt out in EU legislation that concerns home affairs and justice issues. So in this case, Ireland decided not to join the directive, and that is mentioned in Article 69 of the final text on the European Union's Environmental Crime Directive. So you might wonder, so why Ireland, among other states, while other states are joining the directive, you might wonder why Ireland decided not to join the directive. Interestingly, I haven't got any response from the Irish government, so I'm very much looking forward to the Irish government's reply back to my queries on this issue. But as far as I know so far, the Irish Houses of Oireachtas sent a letter to the European Commission suggesting that the Irish common law system is not compatible with what is proposed in the European Union's new environmental crime directive. So it says thresholds for criminal liability set out by the new directive, especially concerning deliberate and negligent acts, are not compatible with the common law system in the Republic. So that's the best knowledge that I have so far to understand why the Irish government decided not to join the directive. But still, it is not so clear on what grounds the Irish government made a final decision to opt out from the directive, because this is particularly because the Irish government opted in some of EU legislation on home affairs and justice issues. So the public needs to know more about why the Irish government decided not to join the directive and what the Irish government will do to protect the environment while not joining the collective efforts to protect the environment and also protect people and the planet from ecocide. Right. So while I'm talking about Ireland, so we know that the island of Ireland is being shared by two jurisdictions. One is the Republic of Ireland, and two is Northern Ireland. So after Brexit, after the UK, United Kingdom left the European Union, policy landscapes have rapidly changed, along with some policy developments in Northern Ireland as well. So I'd like to explore some existing legal frameworks for all island environmental protection, because environmental contamination happening in Northern Ireland also affects the environment in the Republic, and also vice versa is happening. So the existing I can't go through all the existing legal frameworks for all island environmental protection, but what I can highlight is that one, in the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, environmental cooperation is one of the 6 areas for all island cooperation that needs to be done on a cross-border basis. So we have the North-South Ministerial Council, the NSMC, that needs to have some policy dialogues and also develop mechanisms to protect the environment, not only the environment, but also other cross-border cooperation areas. But here, you might know that the Northern Ireland government hasn't been functioning very well, so as the NSMC. Because the NSMC should be administered by ministers in both jurisdictions. So I couldn't find any good policy development or constructive conversations held by the environment ministers across the border. And also, I can see policy development has lagged badly behind. Not to mention the fragmentation of environmental governance and systematic environmental failures in both jurisdictions, sadly, while ecosystems are being sacrificed for capital growth, like agricultural businesses. And also, when we look at the Republic, there are people's struggles against the building of data centers for Google and other huge corporations that at the expense of environmental sustainability. And also in the north and in Northern Ireland, we see gold mining issues and also huge illegal dumps, illegal waste dumps, and all other issues that require cross-border cooperation, which hasn't been which hasn't been and managed and also addressed in a concrete and constructive way. So I'd like to highlight here that just as nature knows no human boundaries, neither do polluters. That's why the European Union introduced their own environmental crime directive to foster cooperation across Europe. And so while Ireland opted out from this new environmental crime directive, it needs to find a way to collaborate with the European Union in terms of environmental protection, also with Northern Ireland particularly, because it is set out by the Good Friday Agreement. Two, there is a real risk here that if environmental protection fails, that will also fail people and ecosystems quite a huge amount, to a huge extent. So all island ecocide must be addressed by transparent and accountable institutions and also interagency cooperation. So there should be a kind of a uniform approach to environmental protection across the border. And also, environmental governance should be accessible and participatory. One of the criticisms against both jurisdictions on the island of Ireland concerning environmental issues is that public participation is so much limited. So this should be remedied by introducing more concrete mechanisms for community participation and also planning. And also, the protection of environmental human rights defenders should be considered more actively by the two governments. And if we, as I said before, shortly, if we have this, one of the highlights from the European Environmental Crime Directive is to protect environmental human rights defenders and also communities from ecocide and environmental pollutions. Now they are defending their rights as well as defending nature's rights in its own term. So as I said, my presentation is a bit more country specific. So I brought one example as a kind of a all island ecocide that is happening on the island of Ireland, which is the slow killing of Lough Neagh. You might know that Lough Neagh is one of the largest freshwater lakes in Europe, and it is the largest freshwater in the British Isles. And this lake has been dying because of several issues like waste dumping, sewage runoff, and also environmental failures to govern the law properly. So, uh, so this is kind of an experiment for us to think, okay, if we have this ecocide law on the island of Ireland, could we prevent or can we prevent further harms against Lough Neagh? So this is why I brought this case. So the Lough Neagh is a backbone of the life on the island of Ireland. It provides drinking water sources for more than 30% of the population in Northern Ireland. Also, some streams are coming down from Lough to the Republic. So ecocide law on the all-island basis is needed to discourage the exploitative production of pollution and waste, like the killing of Lough Neagh. That's what I said. More specifically, if we had this law on the all-island basis, we could operate in a way. We could use the law in a way to protect and restore the community's stewardship of the land as the common land, and then respect the law in its own right, because Ireland, and also I'd like to make a note here that Ireland is now moving towards the constitutional recognition of nature's rights. So this only applies to the Republic, but since Lough Neagh is the largest freshwater lake on the island of Ireland, it concerns the whole population. It should concern the whole population on the island. So Ireland does need to have a say in the management of Lough Neagh. So, while Ireland does have some challenges in protecting the environment without joining the European Union's Environmental Crime Directive, I am arguing that it still needs to do something to prevent further all island ecocide, and also do something to protect the planet in a safer, fairer, and livelier way. So all island cooperation to prevent, stop, and remedy ecocide in Lough Neagh, not only in Lough Neagh, but also other areas, requires a comprehensive and justice-based policy that goes beyond green growth that has been coined by many governments for years. So prosecuting ecocide, if we had this ecocide law on the all island basis, prosecuting ecocide cannot be retrospective. So, for example, like extractive businesses that have caused excessive environmental damage in Lough Neagh, in other areas, may not be prosecuted by the judiciary. However, introducing ecocide law lays the necessary basic framework to prevent further harms and destruction. So, what we need here is to understand ecocide law. As I said before, this represents a people's will to control our society, particularly economic activities that have used our ecosystems for granted as natural resource, which is not compatible at all with the planet, with the health of the planet. So we need a protective framework to limit excessive extraction, pollution, and other harmful practices. And if we had this ecocide law, it is possible to it is possible to develop more policies based on this law to protect the environment. And also, as I said before, we are trying to protect ourselves from a crime, and this gives us more power to defend our rights. So environmental protesters can become environmental protectors. So this is how I can see ecocide law can contribute to protecting the rights of environmental defenders who are increasingly being criminalized by their own governments. And also, finally, the law is to ensure governmental and corporate accountability, as I said before, setting higher standards for due diligence and duty of care to protect Ireland's essential ecosystems now and in the future. So thank you very much. This is the end of my presentation, and I'd like to have more constructive dialogues based on my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jin. Very informative, a lot of information to take in. We have a couple of questions in the chat box. From Limmer, could you say that the opposite is also the case? So when a country did not opt out, the directive is apparently compatible with that particular local common law. In other words, is there some sort of minimum that is required for compatibility so that a country has to opt out when that minimum is not met? I don't know if I'm reading that. Yeah, if that
Yeah,
makes
that's true.
sense to you, Jin.
So,
Yeah.
well, here I need to say that I'm not a legal expert, so I'm a sociologist. So, I'm more oriented to social impact on the law. But what I can say here is that, yes, so there would be a minimum threshold for a country to opt in any European legislation, and that's why the European Parliament has a due processes to reflect each country's stance and each party's stance on the concerned legislation, which means, and also, as I said before, Ireland, the Republic opted in some of EU legislation on home affairs and justice issues, which means that the Republic could have more proactively acted on reflecting their own position on this piece of legislation as well, if the Republic wanted to do so. So that's why I sent some queries to the Irish government, also the Irish Houses of Oireachtas, to see on what grounds the Irish government finally decided to opt out. just sending a letter saying that, oh, this proposed EU directive is not compatible with our law system, doesn't actually justify one's stance on the legislation. I would like to highlight point, if that
There's
answers.
also, thank you, Jane. There's also some discussion in the chat around, that there's speculation Ireland opted out due to pressure, from Irish Farmers Association to protect their membership. Obviously, we're aware of the strength of farmers' lobbies in Ireland. So would you agree with that sort of comment, I guess, that the decision to opt out of the Ecocide directive is from the kind of national pressure, for example, from the IFA. And they made the comment that slurry is obviously a major factor of contamination of surface water streams, rivers, foreshores. So yeah, kind of turned that comment into a question. But yeah, so how much do you think that, the influence of agri-food sectors and IFAs, had on that decision to opt out?
Yeah, thank you for the summary. Yes, so power dynamics play a crucial role in criminalizing particular activities, and I know the farmers' resistance across Europe. I'm now living in Germany. I saw a huge farmer strike that blocked all the roads where I'm living in. But still, there are countries like, including Germany, although Germany was not really big fan of this directive, I must say, still adopted the this legislation. So, yes, the presence of farmers' resistance can be a one factor that may contribute to one government's stance on the legislation. But still, like, this shows what kind of priorities does the Republic have in terms of environmental protection? So, or maybe they don't prioritize and they don't want to prioritize environmental protection over agricultural growth, something. But this needs to be critiqued, vehemently critiqued by the public. And also, I wonder how many people know that the Irish government decided not to join the EU directive on environmental crime. So that's
Yeah, I
another
didn't
issue.
know until
Yeah, that's another
we
issue.
were
So
reading your paper. Yeah.
the public didn't have an opportunity to say something in this important decision.
Fantastic answer. Also, Charlotte in the chat is talking about this idea, of punishment. Um, very interested in this idea of restorative justice approach that Stop Ecocide International promotes. So you can, Jojo, also you can answer and respond to this question as well. But and Ireland obviously is somewhat a good culture of restorative justice approach, and Charlotte provides the example of the Children's Act and the Criminal Justice Victims of Crime Act. So yeah, Charlotte's curious to know what punishment might look like in
Yes,
a
so
yeah.
thank you very
So
much.
feel free.
I think I'll go first, and Jojo, can you jump in, maybe?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, so I'll be very brief. So the European Crime Directive sets higher sentencing, like I think for serious environmental crime, it would be imprisonment for up to 10 to 15 years, and also along with stricter fines. So the member states, without Ireland and Denmark, are obliged to transpose the Environment Crime Directive into their own legislation, national legislation within 2 years. So that would be something that Ireland could do, introducing more stricter sentencing and financial penalties. But also, yes, in criminology, we have this what we call the pyramid of punishment. So that says, so those who are most accountable should be penalized, while for individuals and also maybe small farmers who didn't know what ecocide or the European environmental crime was, they could have more capacity building programs as in exchange of punishment. So yes, yes, restorative justice approaches should be taken alongside preventive and deterrence measures. I can say that, and I'll hand to Jojo.
Yeah, I mean, we're still sort of in the fairly early stages of how, individual jurisdictions will emerge with, you know, what kind of sentencing and so on. And I think we'll obviously see the developments of that over the next couple of years. I mean, interestingly, I mean, at the International Criminal Court, there's also been focus on restorative justice historically as well. And with environmental crimes, there are very obvious benefits all round for incorporating that kind of sentencing. That said, I think it's also important that, you know, things like custodial sentences are included, and that, you know, that effectively what we've seen with the European directive is a kind of, it's almost like that qualified offence that they've put in. It's almost acts as kind of aggravating factor. So, you know, if you've committed one of these 18 crimes and it hits a certain level of harm, then you know, a different level of sentencing is also then applicable. In terms of, I mean, I noticed there was a couple of questions in the Q&A about implementation in Ireland. Now, obviously, I mean, we deal with many different jurisdictions around the world, so it's not like I'm personally able to give an in-depth analysis for Ireland specifically. But in terms of, you know, how that will, you know, what the knock-on effects will be for environmental protection is, you know, we fully anticipate that, you know, prosecutions for ecocide will not be, you know, they'll not be prolific. It's not going to be lots of them, because it's about looking for the worst cases of harm. But what it will do is create a sort of almost like a kind of safety rail of deterrence, because I mean, a good way to explain this is perhaps to look at the different ways that people think about different kinds of laws. So at the moment, environmental regulation tends to be thought of in ways of, you know, how can you perhaps even redefine what you're doing so that it doesn't fit into a certain category. Whereas when you have something like what is the proposed definition of ecocide, which I know it was linked to in the chat earlier by Lucy, and you can also see it here. If I stop my video, you should actually see the international definition there. Is that what that aims at is something that is more akin to how, you know, in criminal law we approach something like murder. It's not about how you kill someone that makes it murder. It's about the fact that they end up dead. And effectively, that's a similar kind of approach within, you know, within this sort of more international level definition of ecocide, but nonetheless, this is the definition that has inspired all of those proposals around the world. So it's saying, you know, whatever you do, it shouldn't hit a certain level of harm. And you'll notice as well, it's not, they don't give sort of numbers to that harm. It's not a certain square kilometerage, or it's not you know, a certain length of time. And that's because with environmental harms, there are so many different ways that harm can manifest that there needs to be a certain amount of leeway given to judges to judge what a reasonable amount of time or a serious amount of harm is in a given context. I mean, just to give a simple example, something like the Bhopal chemical disaster in India, you know, relatively localized but hugely serious. So, you know, again, if you had put a particular kilometrage around that, it might not have covered it, but the severity is not in question. So those kind of things. But to come back to my point about the way people approach things, it's a bit more like, I mean, the example I usually give is if you build a factory, it's a kind of health and safety approach. So if you build a factory, you're not going to build it so that it almost breaks people's heads open all the time, which is actually how people often approach environmental regulation. What you're actually going to do is you're going to build it so that it doesn't break people's heads open. So effectively, what you're doing by putting this outer parameters in place is you're having people withdraw from a danger zone. And that is really important. So another way you could describe it, and Polly used to describe it like this, actually, she said it's like a shift from a risk mitigation approach to an avoiding hazard approach. And that's what the inclusion of an ecocide as a worst, you know, to deal with the worst crimes can potentially do. And that's really important. And to come to the second bit of your question, which is about the sort of sustainable, you know, how will it I think it was something like, how would it support sustainability or something like that? Yeah, contribute to sustainable practices. Yeah. So at the moment, those who are sort of leading in that space in terms of sustainability practices and, you know, businesses that are taking a more responsible attitude, at the moment, they're severely disadvantaged financially, because it's a sort of an uphill struggle against business as usual, because, you know, those who are perhaps less scrupulous are still busy externalizing the costs of damage that they might be creating to the environment. So when you put something in place that potentially has those actors think more carefully before they pollute, in fact, it's exactly what June was saying, the polluter does not pollute principle, you're actually leveling the playing field, which means that it becomes more advantageous also economically to do the right thing. And so, you know, so that's a very sort of concrete knock-on effect of putting this criminal law in place. So it's a kind of, it's a sort of cautionary shift that happens that then obviously encourages that paradigm shift that the earlier question brought into focus.
Thank you, Jojo, for that more wider for in the international context to Karen Deer's questions. I suppose as a summary of the more the context of Ecocide on the island of Ireland, I wonder if it's a good idea, Joe, to revisit Karen Deer's questions, you know, on just to provide a summary, I guess, of your presentation about, you know, oh, the questions have disappeared. But oh yeah, thank you so much. Have you returned this? The key considerations in implementing Ecocide legislation. So a summary, I guess, obviously you've addressed a lot of this in your presentation, but a summary of its potential impact on environmental protection existing and its contribution to sustainable practices and conservation efforts. So I know that's a big question and you have touched on that a lot in your presentation, but for the sake of the webinar, it might be a nice way to summarize the discussions. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I was muted. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I can explain a bit more about how ecocide law can contribute to, you know, strengthening conservation efforts, especially in the case of Lough Neagh. So Lough Neagh is a really huge and important ecosystem on the island of Ireland, which should be protected by which is being protected by technically protected by different pieces of law. Like initially, before the UK left the European Union, it was applied to the EU Habitats Directive and also the European Union's Environmental Impact Assessment Directives. So actually, environmental groups in Northern Ireland brought environmental failures to protect Lough Neagh to the European Commission before, and the European Commission sent a letter to the Stormont, the Northern Ireland government, to explain a bit more about what measures have been taken to protect Lough Neagh. Sadly, now the European Commission cannot extend its mission to Northern Ireland, but we have the Office for Environmental Protection to do so. So actually, the Office for Environmental Protection is doing some works on monitoring, and it doesn't have enforcement power, but it does monitor conservation efforts happening in Northern Ireland. So if we have this kind of environmental ecocide legislation, and speaking of which, Scotland is moving towards the adoption of ecocide law in its own national legal system. So this shows that Northern Ireland also it needs to do it, and it can do it. And also, if it wants to do it, and the Republic should do it on the all island basis. Lough Neagh, if as Jojo mentioned as well, so adding criminal law to environmental protection is like a toolbox approach. So we try to complement the missing gap in environmental protection. For example, like now we can count 3,700 international environmental agreements. So there are really huge number of environmental agreements all around us. But one might question, okay, so we have so many environmental agreements, but why our planet is still burning? I am living in a so hot weather. Why is it so? So there is a missing gap here, and which is in our case, is criminal liability for polluters and accountability for polluters. So this ecocide law is to place a duty of care for polluters who have done their activities like technically freely without being monitored and forced. So in the case of Logne, if we have this ecocide law, then all the environmentally destructive activities should be and will be stopped. Not maybe in an immediate effect, but it should be stopped. And also, again, back to the point on restorative justice, uh, criminalizing particular activities not only concerns with offenders, but also concerns with victims. So in this is why criminalizing ecocide will give more power to victims. And in this case, victims is not only about communities and individuals, but also nature in itself. So Logne will be given a right to say someone will have to represent Logne, but still in our process to help and assist victims, Logne will have a right to say for its own in its own right. So this is how ecocide law can intersect with the idea of the recognition of rights of nature and also duty of care and due diligence. Yes, I think that was the
And
point of the
thank you
question, I
so
think. Yeah.
much, Jane. That was very comprehensive answer. We have another just general question in the chat. Any effort to have the UN Convention on Ecocide? So I don't know what state you're from, but yes, so that this person's state might become a party.
I think Jojo, maybe it's up
Yeah,
to your
Jojo, if you
Is
want
that
to
question.
give
someone
that a go.
asking whether there's a whether there'll be a UN
Yeah,
convention?
like a
Yes,
UN
any
convention on
effort
ecocide, something.
towards
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah,
any
yeah,
effort
yeah.
towards that. Yeah.
I mean, this is suggested on a fairly regular basis, and of course, we would, in theory, completely support a UN convention on ecocide. The reason we focus specifically on the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court is that we know how long it takes to get a new convention in place. I mean, if you look at, the Paris Agreement took over 20 years, and what we have with the Rome Statute is a treaty that's already in place, that already has been successfully amended in the past, that has a process for amendment which has been successfully used, and that therefore represents a fairly immediate route to taking action. Now, we actually don't doubt that further down the line a convention on ecocide is likely to be elaborated, but we sort of feel that the Rome Statute route as a first approach, if you like, makes the most practical immediate sense, because we are, as we all know, in a situation where the deterioration of our biodiversity and the knock-on effects on climate are very rapid, and that this actually needs dealing with as fast as possible. And actually, that's why it's so encouraging to see so many individual jurisdictions where bills are being proposed into parliaments, so that actually what's happening now, we didn't necessarily anticipate it, but this is what's happening, is that we're actually having a mutually reinforcing effect. Where the national and regional developments are helping to nudge the international developments, and yet it's also the international conversation that is driving those. So there's this sort of mutual reinforcement, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of the international proposed definition, because I think that really transformed the conversation. I mean, it's not like we weren't talking about ecocide for some years before that, but the question was always, what exactly do you mean by it? And there were different definitions on the table, including Polly Higgins and others. And so having this consensus definition coming from the independent expert panel has made a truly profound difference to the international conversation. And of course, that was drafted with a fifth crime of ecocide for the Rome Statute in mind.
Maybe I can add just one point to Jojo, that so yes, there is no like hard convention on ecocide, but there are international agreements on not international agreements, but the UN General Assembly has taken resolutions on environmental human rights, and the UN has adopted like the UN Charter for Rights of Nature, and also so basically international bodies and regional bodies are moving towards the protection of the environment in a more active way. So
Yes,
I
it's
might
the
want
same with
to, yeah.
the convention. Sorry, the Council of Europe is also working on
Yeah.
a convention on protection of the environment through criminal law. I think you're absolutely right. It's showing this kind of convergence aspect that we were talking about earlier. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. Yes, you made a point.
I think
Yes,
we've
I think there's a
covered,
question.
what was there another?
Yeah, there's
I think we've
another
covered all
question.
the questions in the Q&As. Thank you so much, Charlotte. That's no problem. Yeah, so if would you like to wait around a couple more minutes for more questions, or
Yeah.
I'm happy
Well,
to.
well, in the chat box, I think there is a question like, is there any way we can stay involved or support or push of ecocide legislation in Ireland?
I can't see that from my side
Oh, really?
anywhere, but that's a great
Oh, really?
question. Oh
Yeah, I
yeah,
think
I think there's more loading here actually. Sorry, I didn't want to rush everyone. We've plenty of time for more questions.
no worries.
I just didn't see this. So
Just a
what
see
role
posted.
does let me see. Oh no, I still can't see that. If
Oh, really?
Well, I mean, I can certainly jump in with
Yeah.
a
Yeah,
bit of
Jojo can comment on this
yeah, I mean,
anyway. Yeah.
one of the and also just Caitlin, just to check, how much time actually do we have?
Yeah, we dedicated like an hour and a half to the webinar, so we were
Okay,
just
right,
if we
because
needed, yeah, if we
I
needed
wasn't
to
sure
finish
if
early
I was half
or if we
expecting you
needed
to
more
go, right,
time.
we've hit the hour, we've got to stop. But no,
And that's it,
which
yeah.
case I think there's a whole bunch of things that we could potentially sort of branch off
Yes.
into. But I mean, the how can we support thing is always very helpful. I mean, I think I mean, EJ and I are obviously working on a number of issues and have a wonderful positioning between kind of briefing at political level, but also interacting with communities and campaigns on the ground. And so I think, you know, that there's probably quite a lot that can be kind of connected into with EJ and I. On the more sort of global level, what I think we observe very obviously here is that this is really about a conversation. So it's about a kind of global level conversation. And as far as Stop Ecocide International is concerned, we operate on these two different levels. So on one level, you know, we're kind of advising in and facilitating and supporting at the diplomatic level. So which is often closed door, which kind of ambassadors and legal advisors and politicians and so on. Then in the more public arena, what we do a lot of is this kind of cross-feeding of the conversation around ecocide law into as many different sectors as possible. And often, you know, our biggest barrier is simply that people don't have the understanding around what ecocide law can facilitate. And so, you know, anybody watching who is in, you know, has an organization that interacts with policy, we would advise, you know, if it's where it's possible, to drop in the conversation on ecocide law into whatever submissions you're making. In the context of sort of public, so for example, if your organization produces reports, if you or articles or holds public events of any kind, anything that or interacts with the media, you know, if there's an opportunity to bring in ecocide law, even if it's just, I know this sounds really mild, but it really makes a difference. You know, when people say, well, you know, what could also be relevant here is you know, this growing, you know, legal momentum towards the criminalization of ecocide. It could be a really important conversation to pay attention to. And even if that's the only thing that you say, it makes, you know, it brings it into another arena of discussion, for example. And what we're finding at the level of the, you know, the UN missions and the diplomatic conversation is that one of the things that is really driving this is the fact that the conversation is live in so many areas of civil society, and particularly in, you know, academia, the legal arena, NGOs, interest groups, faith groups, youth groups. I mean, there's a lot of different contexts. So it really does make a difference. And then the final area, of course, is the sort of private arena, you know, your own conversation, you know, whether it's kitchen table conversations, whether it's your own personal networks, but also potentially within your sector. So, you know, whatever sector you're working in, where does that sector convene? You know, where are your yearly conferences, or where are your you know, your membership associations, and you know, are there newsletters that they produce, and those kinds of things where this conversation can be included. All of those things are super helpful.
Thanks, Jojo. We have another question. In regards to your engagement with politicians, are they generally keen, supportive? How do you access and persuade them? That's a great question, Caroline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this is through I mean, it's almost a how long is a piece of string question, in the sense that there are so many different ways that one can potentially be interacting with policymakers, whether that's, at an individual level, writing to your elected representative, but often there may also be other, connections that you have, or that people have. And one of the things that really characterizes this work has been that connecting aspect. Who knows who, and who can you get talking to who, because you happen to sort of be in between a series of different connections. That's also super important. What we would say is one of the things that we believe has really given us kind of quite high level access is the specificity of what we're doing. What we find is that because we are asking for a very specific thing, we're recommending a very specific thing: criminalize the worst harms to nature. Basically, make ecocide a crime. That's it. What we don't do is set a broad political agenda, or come out with a 5-point plan to save the world, or to fix the entirety of the Irish environmental question, or whatever it is. It's very, very specific. And what that helps with politically is you don't get snagged on party politics. And actually that's really quite important, and particularly this year, as you know, I mean, it's an election year in half the world this year, and we've actually made a kind of conscious decision to not try to make it an election issue, because it's actually so fundamental and foundational in terms of a framework that it would be unfortunate for it to be caught up in somebody's particular political agenda. Now, that doesn't mean it's not worth pointing out when people are talking about ecocide law as part of their manifestos, for example. That's great. But what we wouldn't do, for example, is we wouldn't say, well, therefore you should vote for them and not them. We would say, okay, well, actually what this means is that more people should be talking about ecocide, because it brings it into the arena. Another aspect which is quite interesting is that, of course, a lot of the discourse around climate and around ecological breakdown is emergency type talk, which is on one level is necessary, and completely understand that. But ecocide law is not an emergency response. It's a fundamental missing piece that needs to be there, and that needs to be there ongoingly into the future, regardless of whatever else is happening. And actually, politically, that's actually quite useful, because it's often quite scary for politicians to be thrown into a kind of emergency response type space. And it isn't, and it also can be problematic also from the public point of view, because obviously if a government does decide to take an emergency approach to something, then suddenly you can find things, being legislated overnight that might be tricky. And it's not that some things like that may be required in certain circumstances, but with ecocide law we see it as a very common sense, stabilizing, safety focused framework, and that I think is really quite helpful when dealing with political conversations. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Jojo. There's also a comment in the chat, which is a good point. This idea of obviously with all the wars, this idea that national security usurps environmental crimes. That's, I think that's an important, maybe a thing to discuss or raise. Yeah.
I can respond to that question if I may. So the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court does have an article in the context of war crimes to punish environmental damage that has been caused excessively in relation to the purpose of military purposes. But this is quite tricky. This article has never been used by the court, because it's really difficult to establish the causal relationship between military operations that happened and environmental contamination, and two, that's because of the first reason. It is really difficult for the judiciary to and also it's quite a pitfall here, dilemma here. So this law, when it comes to when environmental damage is criminalized as a part of war crimes, then it is the court to evaluate whether what would be a justifiable means to destroy the environment for military purposes. This is quite a nonsense for the judiciary, and this doesn't serve the purpose of the Rome Statute. That's a dilemma. But yes, I wouldn't say, because that's why I said, well, ecocide law is a kind of a toolbox, should have a toolbox approach. We're not here to criminalize all the individuals and all the people around the world. And it is really difficult to criminalize state acts, national security practices at the discretion of national governments. And if you look at the Paris Agreement or the Kyoto Protocol, the military sector is exempted from climate responsibility, which is really, for me, it's not really justifiable. But there is a ground for national security apparatuses to evade responsibility, and I would say, rather than kind of a crime-based or criminalizing approach to security actors, we would need something else. I mean, but on the other hand, the Council of Europe and also the OSCE, I forgot its full name. So it's quite a huge name.
Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the OSCE Council has also moved to adopt a resolution on ecocide, so they understand ecocide is also part of the national security issue. Although security actors like the military wouldn't be criminalized or punished for those kind of acts. So what we need here is that while we have this ecocide law being advocated, we might want to demand more responsibility for those like the military and also arms companies, arms producers. On the other hand, but so if you want to look at what kind of campaigns are going on to strengthen military responsibility for environmental protection, then you might want to see other initiatives like the Conflict and Environmental Observatory, etc. But yeah, so it is. So my argument is that it is really difficult to criminalize everyone, and particularly the military security sector, and it may not be a good way to deal with military impact on the environment in that way. Oh yeah, the
I come in
Global Green
briefly.
Congress. Yeah. Oh wait, go on.
Coming briefly there. I mean, obviously a standalone crime of ecocide in theory would apply in both peacetime and in conflict. But I think there's also a growing awareness that environmental damage in itself can also be a threat to national security. So, and indeed kind of peace and security globally. In fact, there was a report that came out last year that was looking at the situations that were currently at that point being examined by the International Criminal Court, and they virtually all had an element of climate and environmental harm that was either at the part of the cause of a conflict situation or the particular situation, or it was a means of how it was happening, or it was a result. So it's like it's virtually impossible to unravel any of the kind of situations that the Rome Statute would be addressing, which are effectively often do have impact on national security, without coming across quite severe elements that involve the environment. So one could even argue that putting an ecocide law in amongst those international laws is almost an imperative in order to give the rest of the laws the full force that they need. And of course, there's also a slight difference in how, I mean, for example, in peacetime, we would see ecocide law, and this would very much apply in the Ireland context, as a kind of an accountability and deterrence aspect. In other words, the idea would be to shift behavior. It's not to throw lots of people in jail, it's to shift behavior. Now, in the context of a conflict, that may not apply in the same way, in that, whether somebody is in a position of carrying out a military attack, whether it's actually going to put them off that ecocide law is a crime, is debatable. But what it potentially does is create a level of separate justiciability, obviously within, with the caveats already put in place by June in his answer.
Thanks, Jojo. A more very specific question in regards to what role does community engagement play in both supporting ecocide legislation and promoting waste management? So that's very, very specific, but I don't know if you have, good examples of that. Does anyone want to?
I mean, waste management is a huge issue in both jurisdictions on the island of Ireland. My doctoral thesis was about the mobile dump, illegal dump, one of the largest illegal dumps
Yeah.
in Western Europe, known to the public. So yes, and this is really a difficult issue. I mean, waste management is really a difficult issue, but causes serious harms and really long-term damage to ecosystems. Like if we look at the mobile dump itself, it's the size of the dump is not established yet, so we don't know how much waste has been illegally buried. And while we don't have exact information on the level of pollution, while the waste, one of the problems that waste management, the failures in waste management has is that it causes long term, while time goes, it causes more and more environmental damage. And it is really difficult to remediate the site, as we see the mobile dump is just left behind the government, and the government says we don't have money and we cannot, clean up the site. So it's better to just leave the dump, leave the dump site alone. Try to, so they do for example, the NI Water, the Northern Ireland Water, is doing emergency responses when it rains, when it heavily rains around the mobile dump site. But that's the only measures that the Northern Ireland government has taken, and maybe could have taken. If we have ecocide law, speaking of which, the owners of the mobile dump site are now being, well, there hasn't been any sentencing yet, but there is a court case going on against the owners of the mobile dump site. But if we had this, we don't know how much fines that the owners of the mobile dump site would have to pay. But if we had this ecocide law before this case was happening, maybe we would expect the owners of the mobile dump, and also not only the mobile dump, but also other waste offenders could face more serious responsibility for what they have done. So, as I said before, it's the ecocide law is to guarantee and introduce safeguards for the government to make sure that people don't pollute the environment first. So this means if we have ecocide law, then the way of handling waste, or the way of producing, processing, maybe storing waste, and also the government's way of monitoring waste management would be different from what we have. So that would be kind of my intake from the intersection between ecocide law and waste management.
Yeah, there's a great podcast about the Maboy dump called Buried. If people, maybe we can find the link for that. It's very comprehensive investigation into it. So another question around the conversation of the interconnectedness between ecocide legislation and public health and environmental protection. I think you've covered a good, but yeah, if you want to tackle that again. So I can't remember whether I read that question or not.
Yeah, no, I was going to say I haven't seen the actual wording of it, but I think that this is another one of those cultural issue kind of points, if you like, where we don't always make an immediate connection between the health of the environment and the health of people, and of course, the two are absolutely intertwined. So that there's also a way in which it's interesting actually, because there's a whole discourse here that this sort of touches on around, whether something is ecocentric or anthropocentric, our sort of existing legal systems being, largely focused on people and property, and therefore anthropocentric, and we need to have an ecocentric focus. But I think the question about, where you look at the intersection between public health and the health of the environment, you start to realize that actually, in a way, it's a sort of a false dichotomy, because, we actually are all part of a living entangled ecosystem, if you like, which includes us, and so that the more we can understand that, the the better the parameters we will be putting when we're asking public health questions, if you see what I mean. So I'm taking this from a little bit of a sort of broad view here. But for example, I think it's interesting that that the independent expert panel, when they came up with the Ecocide definition, included amongst the possibilities of how, you know, a severe harm to the environment could be defined is or I think it's under widespread actually, you know, is that if it affects a large number of human beings. And of course that could be a situation with, you know, chemical pollution, for example, or air pollution, or those kinds of things. So it does keep that potential linkage, even though the definition could be met by something that simply created horrible damage to the environment but didn't immediately affect people. But the reality is that longer term it always affects people, and that's, you know, when it comes down to it, you know, it is about looking after ourselves as much as it is about looking after the planet. You know, we are part and parcel.
I'm unaware of what this question means, but I'm going to put it to you anyways. But in which country would you challenge Monsanto and Bayer with ecocide prosecution, and are there plans to do so?
That's a,
So,
that's a
Do you
great
want
question.
don't know
to
if I've missed something.
No, I mean, I don't know if June's got any particular comments on that, but I mean, we have a kind of policy of not pointing fingers at very specific actors, because we, you know, we're very much looking at putting a framework in place that could apply to any specific harm that reaches a certain level. Of course, it's going to be a question of what text finally is adopted, and whether that text could apply to activities that it was Monsanto and Bayer, wasn't it? That, you know, that they are specifically engaging in. I don't doubt that there are a number of people that would like to get their teeth into a case like that. But, you know, at this stage, it's a little bit too, you know, we don't have the sort of direct details of anything like that happening. The other thing is that, I mean, sometimes we do get asked this about specific cases. I have to say that our organization is unlikely ever to be taking specific cases, because that's not what we do. We are an advocacy organization. We nurture a conversation. We are not a legal firm taking cases. But the other thing to bear in mind as well with ecocide law is that this is not about a kind of like a civil litigation. It's not about, say, a community against a company, which, you know, I mean, the classic example that always springs to mind for me is the Chevron case in Ecuador, for example, where you had the indigenous and local communities in a case against a big oil company. When you've got a criminal law, it is actually the state that prosecutes. So it's not quite the same kind of situation. And it's not like you would, you know, I don't know, crowdfund for a case and put a set of lawyers on it. It would be a question of where in the jurisdiction in which that law has been adopted, will the state then prosecute a particular company? And obviously it would have to have specific reported and evidenced reasons to do so.
Thanks, Jojo. There's a lot of interesting links and information in the chat. So Stop Ecocide has, you know, just email, I think Robin's provided an email address to send around the information in the chat after the webinar. So don't panic, anyone. You will have access to these links again. I know it's very interesting. But yes, I think potentially we can conclude here, unless June or Jojo, you have any final remarks, conclusions. A lot was covered there.
Yeah, I was going to say that was a nice bonus. I hadn't realised that we had an hour and a half, which is great. So yeah, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, and hope that it's provided a good introduction to the topic, but also in the context of the island of Ireland. And I love the fact that it's the all island conversation just really underlines how, you know, with environmental harm, I mean, environmental damage doesn't respect, you know, human decided borders, and also doesn't respect you know, it has a different kind of temporal effect as well, and I think that's also, you know, become hopefully clear during the conversation. So yeah, it's been a real pleasure to be here. So thank you so much for co-hosting this with us.
No, and thank you so much. speakers, of course, June, Jojo, and thank you so much to the attendees and all the engagement throughout the webinar. And I really look forward to the campaigns of Stop Ecocide International. You're doing such amazing work. And it's been a joy to work with June on the briefing paper with Environmental Justice Network Ireland. And I've included the link. It's also on ResearchGate. If you just want to sink your teeth even further into the potential implementation of ecocide legislation in the Ireland environment, what that would look like. I feel like Lough Neagh is obviously a fantastic case study to apply these ideas to. And yes, so that's it from me. And thank you all again.